Okay, today we start working with solving quadratic equations, and this is a very important skill for pre-calculus, and we're going to learn several ways to solve them. We're going to solve them by factoring. We're going to solve them by completing the square. These are all the different, there's several more. We're going to learn to solve them with the quadratic formula. We're going to learn to solve them graphically with the graphing calculator. And there's another little method that's called extracting the square. So we've got all these methods, and we're going to have to know how to use all of them, okay, to solve quadratic formulas. And when we talk about a quadratic equation or a quadratic formula, we're talking about one that's in this form: ax squared plus bx plus c, and for us to solve it, it has to be equal to 0. Okay, the highest power of x is 2 in a quadratic equation. Okay, so if I don't have an x squared, then I don't have a quadratic equation. Okay, if my highest power is just an x, then that would be what we call a linear. All right, so we're going to get right to some examples here, and the first one that we're going to go over is to solve by factoring. And if I could name one skill that all of us need to work on, this is it: factoring. A lot of you, even on the test, had some issues with this. So let's say that we have 2x squared plus 9x plus 7 equals 0. Now, I'm not going to do I'm going to do, I guess, some factoring problems where maybe we have to think a little bit more. Remember, anytime my a term is not 1, it's good to use the product sum method. So let's come over to the side. 2 times 7 is 14. So now I need two numbers that multiply to give me 14, but add up to be positive 9. So it's going to be the same two numbers: positive 2, positive 7. So I have 2x squared plus 2x plus 7x plus 7 equals 0. Okay? And doing my factoring, I take out a 2x out of here, and I'm left with x plus 1. I take a 7 out of here, and I'm left with x plus 1. That equals 0. Remember, it starts as an equation, and we have to finish it as an equation. Let's make our steps be good here. So now I have 2x plus 7 times x plus 1 equals 0. Now, there is a very important property that we use when we're solving these equations. It's called the zero product property. And what this property says is that if I have two things multiplied together, like we do here, okay, if I have two things multiplied together and they equal 0, doesn't one of them have to be 0? Right? So in this case, there are two possible solutions, it looks like. There's not always two possible solutions, but in this case, there will be. We split this up and we set up two little mini equations. And you've probably done this a little bit in Algebra 2. And we solve each of those little mini equations separately. Please don't skip steps. A lot of you lost points on the test because you're skipping steps and making mistakes. So subtract 7, 2x equals negative 7. This is a classic case where some of you, there was a question on the test where some of you, and that from here, made the mistake of trying to skip straight to the answer instead of actually showing this little step of dividing by 2. Some of you got your numbers flip-flopped. Instead of 10 over 6, you had 6 over 10. Okay? So don't skip that step. My first solution is -7/2. This one's easier. X equals -1. So I have 2 answers. All right? And let's go to the next example. Now, of course, these things are going to look all kinds of different whopper-jawed ways. We may have to manipulate them a little bit before we start. What's wrong with this one before I start? It's not equal to 0. Very good. So the first thing I need to do is subtract 14. Good job. So I have -x squared plus 9x minus 14 equals 0. Now, if it were me, the next thing that I would do is multiply by -1, because I don't like to factor when the x squared term is a negative. So I'm going to multiply -1 by all of these terms. Remember, I have to do it to this side too. Even though we know it's going to be 0, let's make sure our algebra steps make sense. So now I'm going to have a 0, of course, and I'm going to have x squared minus 9x plus 14 equals 0, and I feel better already. We should not need to do product sum on this one. We should be able to just go straight to backwards FOIL and factor this one without it. All I need is 2 things that multiply to give me 14 and add up to be 9. Since this is a negative, these are both minuses. That's a plus. So this one's easy once we get it in the right format. We split this up into 2 little mini equations equal to 0, and we solve those. And then we have our answers. X equals 7, x equals 2. Okay? Now, I better do one of these problems just because if I don't, somebody might come in crying tomorrow. And maybe now we'll see if you learned anything in the last unit. As soon as I see that, the very first thing that enters into my mind is I want to get rid of fractions. Okay? So what can I do to this quadratic equation to get rid of fractions? Multiply by 4, and be careful, you have to multiply everything by 4. All right? So I'm going to do 4 times 5/4 x squared plus 4 times 10x plus 4 times 15 equals 4 times 0. And on this first fraction, we get what I wanted. Get out the slasher, and I just have 5x squared plus 40x plus 60 equals 0. Now, I'm going to show you another little trick. Do you see something else I could do before I start factoring? Couldn't I pull out a 5? Boy, that would make it easier. Pull out a 5. If I pull out a 5, I have x squared plus 8x plus 12. Oh, that's refreshing. What do I do with that 5? I mean, technically, I know it's going to go away, but how do we make it go away? Let's make sure our algebra steps are good. You're technically dividing both sides by 5. That's really how it goes away. All right? Don't skip that step, because otherwise you've left off a step. So now I have x squared plus 8x plus 12 equals 0. Now I can factor this one. I don't need product sum because it's just x plus 6, x plus 2, split it into 2, x equals -6, x plus 2 equals 0, x equals negative 2. Okay? So that gets you a little start on factoring. We're going to learn one of the other methods today, and that's extracting the square. So now let's solve by extracting the square. Kind of sounds painful. Kind of sounds like they're taking out a tooth or something. So let's say that we have, we'll start easy, 4x squared equals 12. Now right away, one of the things I want you to notice is that there's not three terms. Okay? Even if I were to take the 12 over, you know, if I were to try to subtract 12 from both sides, I would have a middle term missing. Okay? So part of the deal is knowing when should I use this extracting the square. This is going to be a good chance for us to do that, because watch. All I need to do on this problem is divide both sides by 4, and I have x squared equals 3. And how can I finish it? Take the square root of both sides. Let's do that on a separate step for our notes. I know you wouldn't have to do that. Now, pay attention to this. It's not just the square root of 3. It's positive and negative square root of 3. And no, you don't have to check these tonight, but I am going to show you with a little check why that is true. If I put in the negative square root of 3 into this original problem, I have 4 times the negative square root of 3 squared. Does that equal 12? Well, isn't a negative times a negative a positive, right? So this is going to wind up being 4 times 3, which is 12. So that's why we have to include both the positive and the negative square root of 3. Now, if you have one like this, you should also use extracting the square. X minus 3, the quantity squared, equals 7. I've got a binomial squared, right? So if I take the square root of something squared, doesn't the square go away? And I'm just left with x minus 3, right? Now be careful though. What I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So I now have x minus 3 equals, now watch, plus or minus the square root of 7. So I'm not done yet. I need to add 3 to both sides. And how do I write this answer? Well, there's 2 ways. There's what I would call the easy way, which is like this. 3 plus or minus the square root of 7. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That is a correct answer. Or I could actually find, you need to understand that there's 2 answers. If I wanted to find those 2 answers, I would have 3 plus the square root of 7 and 3 minus the square root of 7. And then you would get out your calculator and you'd find out what that is. Let's do that just because I want you to see that there are actually 2 answers. The square root of 7, what is that? About 2.65. All right? So if I have 3 plus 2.65, I have 5.65 approximately as one of my answers. And then on the other one, I'm going to have 3 minus 2.65, which should be like 0.35. 3 minus 2.65, yep. So my other answer is 0.35. So you need to understand, if you write it this way, that there are 2 solutions that do correspond to actual numbers. And we're going to stop there for today.